officially welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. It is day 4,431 of us doing business. And while I have mentioned some events coming up, they all pale in comparison to tonight's event. I just want to say that Barrett Swanson is joining us for the essay collection Lost in Summerland. And I just want to say two things about it to show the love. I enjoyed the book a lot, but as have other people. So when we had a wonderful event and year with the amazing Coyotes of Carthage by Steven Wright, and I said to him, because I so enjoy listening to him talk, I said, who would you like to do an event with? And he wrote back to me, he said, I want to do it with Barrett Swanson. And lo and behold, I had just started reading the book. This event, I want to note, is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Milwaukee Public Library. And I also want to say something, because I didn't really realize one of the things that's interesting about being a Wisconsinite in a New York publishing world is that all local references are veiled. If somebody grows up in New York, you will know the exact street in Brooklyn they live on. But if they're in Wisconsin, it's all rather vague. And so I didn't really understand that Barrett Swanson grew up in the Milwaukee area, I should say. And so I was talking the book up at the Friends of the Milwaukee Public Library event. The head of the Friends of the Milwaukee Public Library, Ryan Daniels, said to me, oh, Barrett's mother is on the call. So I get another champion, and that's just something I loved. And so with that said, that wasn't even the introduction. So I'm passing things over to Steve Wright, the author of Coyotes of Carthage, professor at UW Law School, teaches creative writing, and does an amazing event. I put a burden on you.
Well, thank you for that, and welcome everyone. First, let me just say a special thank you to Daniel and the entire team at Boswell. If you're here, you probably know the essential role that independent bookstores played during the pandemic. Boswell and other indies have served as an essential community forum for people who like to live a life of ideas and who enjoy the world of narrative. So a special thank you to Daniel, the entire team in Boswell, for permitting us this hour to talk about a fantastic book in their space. I want to start, I guess, a little bit with perhaps a personal note. I met Barrett maybe about 10 years ago, one of many writers living here in Wisconsin with strong ties to the University of Wisconsin-Madison's graduate MFA writing program. But he and I really didn't become friends and start hanging out until about 4 years ago. And, it was then that I learned that Barrett is kind and generous, thoughtful and clever. And these are traits that I normally try to avoid in friends. But I made an exception for Barrett. And although we got to know each other and spend a lot of time together, I really learned more about Barrett through his essays. I learned about the exciting adventures that he takes around the nation, but I also learned about the challenges that have shaped his life, his experience with loss of friends, trauma in his family, and of course, his own personal struggles with mental health. But I also learned about his passion for his wife and his family and his dedication to the proposition that all people, no matter their quirks and eccentrics, and there are a lot of quirky and eccentric people in the book, that they should be taken seriously and treated with dignity. The lessons that I learned about Barrett are now available to you all. You can read about him and his adventures in this thoughtful collection, Lost in Summerland, which a brag, the New York Times proclaimed as an impressive debut. The review went on to say his essays reveal a thinker willing to wrestle with the realization that there is more beyond his sight. In addition to receiving strong reviews from the New York Times and places like Publishers Weekly, he's got amazing blurbs from some of the best writers of our generation. And recently, to boot, he sold the TV film rights to a production company in California. So we'll talk all about that, but The book is, of course, Lost in Summerland. The author is Barrett Swanson, and Barrett, welcome.
Thank you, Steven, so much. And thanks so much for doing this. And I want to thank to Daniel and Boswell Book Company, as well as the Friends of the Milwaukee Public Library for inviting us to have this conversation. I've been on a whirlwind since the book came out, but I've been especially excited to talk to you, Steve, just because our friendship has come to mean a lot to me. And yeah, I always enjoy our chats over coffee anyway.
So I want to begin just so we're all sort of on the same footing. The book is a collection of, I believe, 14 essays, most of which were written probably over the past 5-7 years.
Yes.
What do you want people to know about the book? Let's just start with you telling us about the book's idea, the conception. What is it that makes the book so special for so many readers like Daniel and I?
Yeah, well, I think there may be kind of two registers in which the book operates, and the first is a personal one, and then the second, I think, would be a kind of national one. And the personal one really is born of a kind of personal crisis I had in my mid-20s when I was nearly lethally depressed, and I began to conceptualize that headspace not so much as a genetic misfortune, as depression is often characterized, but as really an outgrowth of certain cultural conditions about what has meaning and what doesn't. This kind of idea that's propagated by neoliberal capitalism, that you should be, X, Y, Z. And so in reckoning with kind of that headspace and and looking around me in the wake of the post-2008 recession, I began to see a similar sadness or similar lostness in many swaths of the country, or many different people, particularly in my students and in my friends. And I began to notice how people were taking up surrogate ideologies, or these new political ideas. Some people deferring to conspiracy theories, some people taking up new ageism, some people taking up techno-utopianism. And what I began to discover in doing some of these magazine assignments, having places like Harper's send me to these various spots, is that the narratives that these new narratives that were being discussed were actually as deeply entangled as some of the vexing questions about this country and who we are and our history as anything else is. And oftentimes these subcultures or these new narratives would come under the banner of progressivism, right? Something like a men's retreat or techno-utopianism would come under the sign of advancing things for people, and what it doing during the course of the reporting or during the course of the research, I really began to pull back the curtain on some of those things and notice how they were actually perpetuating certain structural issues from the get-go. So it's really kind of two modes, and I think the book is on one hand a sort of personal reckoning, but also a national exploration as well.
And let's talk about both of those, but let's talk a little bit about the personal exploration. One of the things that at least strikes me about these narratives is that they're very candid and very intimate and very personal. You share the struggles with everything from, your own states of depression, suicidal idealization, as well as, there are several essays about your brother who was the victim of a traumatic assault that led to a traumatic brain damage. There are commentaries on your parents' marriage. And, I'm wondering whether being that candid and being that vulnerable with strangers sort of come to you. It sort of struck me in particular. I'm a guy that doesn't even like to give out my cell phone number, even though it's like publicly listed. But you're saying, you're revealing so much about yourself, and use that in part as the lens by which you're judging everything else. So, could you share a little bit about, was that easy for you to share? Do you have any sort of personal lines? And, what might those essays be without you being as vulnerable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it doesn't, that kind of personal disclosure doesn't come readily available to me. I think for whatever reason, writing has always been a space in which I felt like that was the space in which I could interrogate some of those things. But as I've grown as a writer, and particularly as I started doing some magazine journalism, for which I was often dispatched to certain, let's call them kooky subcultures. I go to a spiritualist community in upstate New York. So one of the essays in the collection is the title essay. It's called Lost in Summerland. And I go to this place called Lilydale with my brother. And it's a compound of 275 psychics and mediums who every summer open up their gates to something like 22,000 tourists every summer and do astrology walks, seances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as a journalist and as a magazine writer walking into those spaces, I think a younger version of myself may have been predisposed to chuckle and sneer, right? And at some of the things that I saw, there was a kind of, there was a fairy garden and a healing temple and all of these things. And I guess I grew increasingly suspicious of a kind of reflexive condemnation or a kind of voguish denunciation of people who struck me as in real pain. It wasn't unsurprising to me during the course of that essay to hear testimonies from people who had suffered tremendous loss, family members who died suddenly, people who had gone bankrupt after the 2008 recession, and who were groping for some narrative and some system of thinking that could help resuscitate them. And so entering into that space, in terms of how I think about kind of balancing my critical lens and my personal disclosure, I almost now will not write a piece unless I'm willing to implicate myself and willing to go and reveal things that that are emotionally taxing to discuss, but that I also think put me and the subjects that I'm writing about on the same level, right? Like I'm putting all of us up for the reader's scrutiny together. And I find when I don't always succeed, but when I feel that I've done a decent job of that, what happens is that the implicating of myself ends up implicating the reader. And there's this kind of triangulation between writer and subject and reader. And that's kind of my lodestar when I'm thinking about the sort of personal and ethical dimensions of whatever it is I'm writing about. And this kind of impulse is recurrent for me. I'm kind of always drawn to these spaces. I think in large measure because I've occupied headspaces where I've felt desperate for some narrative and some way of making heads or tails of what has meaning and what doesn't. And yeah, I don't know if that's a cogent answer to the question, but hopefully it goes some way toward maybe sending us down the path.
Yeah, and so I mean, the treatment of the people that you meet, and for people who haven't had an opportunity to look at the book yet, I mean, I would say maybe half, maybe more of the essays, you go on a little bit of an adventure, right? I mean, they're sort of just fun to read. Like, you in the first part of the essay, you're setting up, and then all of a sudden we're learning in the first page, we're going to learn that Barrett's beneath a bunch of rubble in a town that the government has created for search and rescue dogs. Barrett's going to this weird wilderness retreat with all these men who are trying to rediscover and redefine their masculinity. There's a West Wing convention. There's a convention for psychics and soothsayers. Like, that is objectively pretty cool. So, I mean, but I do agree that one of the things that I did impress me is that through these adventures, you meet a cast of really sort of zany and eccentric people. And I think the impulse for, a writer, and particularly a lesser writer, might be occasionally to wink at the camera, right? Might be the surrender to urge to sort of get the cheap laugh, or to make someone representing thing. But not only do you, it seems like you often see yourself in these people, you treat them with a great deal of dignity and respect. And what's more interesting, you treat their ideas with a great deal of dignity, respect. So, whether it's the fortune tellers, or, the men who, I mean, my opinion, are a little bit absurd out in the middle of the world trying to learn how to howl and recapture their masculinity. I mean, it's an honest interrogation of the people and the ideas.
Yeah, that's right. I teach Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. In fact, I taught that book this semester to a class of students, an incredibly bright class of students, for an advanced creative writing class called Prose Stylistics. And we were kind of looking at different literary styles from the late 19th century all the way through the contemporary moment. And so we started with Mrs. Dalloway, and in that book, Virginia Woolf, one of her protagonists, Clarissa, is looking at this religious woman who is stealing the attentions of her daughter. And very late in the book, Woolf has this character thinking about her animosity towards this woman. And she says, hate is for ideas and not for people. And as the character kind of apprehends this woman toward whom she has animosity, she slowly kind of softens, her animus towards this person defrosts. And I kind of get misty-eyed in an inappropriate and somewhat embarrassing fashion when I'm teaching this moment to my students. And I think a couple of them are actually here tonight, so they can attest to this. But that sensibility, or that being able to parse the person and the idea, and kind of have those two things coexisting at the same time during these reporting trips is the whole ball game for me as a writer. Because one, I'm desperately interested in thinking about, well, what would motivate someone to take up this kind of narrative, and two, what is this narrative providing and what is it obscuring, right? Something, I mean, the thing that you brought up about the many adventures, the places Barrett will go, kind of quality to some of the essays, right? So the Disaster City piece, that was definitely a piece in which I felt like this is going to be a zany madcap adventure. Harper's had heard about Disaster City, and they sent me there. So Disaster City is a 52 acre training compound in College Station, Texas, where FEMA sends all of their search and rescue teams to do live simulations in basically an entire town that's constructed to perform every cataclysm of woe, and woe, right? So there's train derailments, building collapses, pandemics, nuclear attacks, mass shootings, pandemics, and I was conscripted as what they called a victim volunteer. They hire about 100 volunteers around the community of College Station to come serve as pretend victims. They put moulage on these people. There's gore, and they have like impalements, metal impalements sticking out of people, and then they place you in 15 feet of rubble down in a small claustrophobia inducing sized space, and have these search and rescue teams, many of whom were there on 9/11 or served in the campfires in California, and that's how they train. So initially going into that experience, I was like, this will be fun, right? I'm gonna have a great time. Like, this will just be kind of a Epcot-like adventure. And in advance of my trip, as is kind of my MO, because I often feel imposter syndrome about doing these things, kind of entering these subcultures, not knowing what I'm doing, I really try to give myself like a breakneck undergraduate education in whichever in whichever topic I'm exploring. And so I read a bunch of books about disaster preparedness. And one of the things that I uncovered during that research was the extent to which America's disaster preparedness is roughly commensurate with political narratives about what is America's threat. So FEMA was developed in the early 1970s, I believe. And around that time, all of the US government's preparedness appropriations were really for staving off a nuclear attack from Russia. So lots of Cold War thinking. We were kind of locked in this vestigial narrative about the Cold War. And what was actually the most ready and urgent threat were things like hurricanes and shoddy building construction and these sorts of kind of slapdashedly made buildings, often at the behest of profit-driven real estate magnates trying to make a buck, building in hazardous landscapes. And so the narrative that the country had, what was inflecting the kind of cultural imagination, was dictating appropriations of funds. And sure enough, the disasters that did happen, those hurricanes, et cetera, were egregiously devastating. And usually the devastation fell upon class lines. The people that could afford to flee or could afford to insure, protect themselves, did so. And those who didn't were the victims of kind of a structural choice. So even something as seemingly zany as like a kind of disaster city, like I thought I would go in and there would be lots of, and I think there was lots of rich dramatization for scenes and these kinds of ideas about simulation. And like I got very into the postmodern element of it, that we were kind of in a simulation, because I went only a month before the pandemic actually occurred, maybe less than a month actually. So I was interested in those ideas, but then the research is what really calibrated my thinking in going into this spaces, and it got me to think about the people who were there differently, right? And these sorts of, I'm kind of intensely fixated on uncovering these narratives. I mean, one of the more readily apparent ones that I'm thinking about is the way in which we think about essential workers, or how that narrative has become, so dominant in the culture during the COVID pandemic, and what effect that has. It obscures the extent to which these people, often many of whom don't make minimum wage or are of a lower economic class. And so we're lionizing them as heroes, and they are in some sense, but they are also the martyrs for certain iterations of neoliberal capitalism, right? They're the ones. So there's a way in which this kind of essential worker, the fact that our TV commercials sort of lionize these folks, right? It obscures the true debts we may owe them, which is maybe like working toward a better minimum wage or more stable economic opportunity, et cetera. So I guess that's kind of my disposition as a thinker as I go into these spaces. Yeah.
Okay. So the book, of course, is Lost in Summerland. Publishers Weekly called it full of measured skepticism. Swanson's sharp interrogation of contemporary American life hits hard and true. So, just a reminder there, you can leave questions in the chat. Let's talk a little bit about narratives and the narratives sort of we tell ourselves. I was reminded of the quote from Joan Didion: "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." But what I found interesting is not only the narratives that people sort of tell you about themselves or what an organization or society is telling you, but there seems to be a lot about you. One of the themes it seems throughout the book is sort of, you wrestling a little bit to define your own narrative. I think in particular the first essay, the first essay takes place. You're down in Florida. You're going through sort of a personal malaise, but you're also finding it impossible to complete a narrative. The novel you were working on was sort of floundering. There are examples of, you hang out with your nieces and nephews and not being able to really complete sort of basic stories. And so I'm wondering, tell me about that struggle to develop your own narrative, and is it tied to sort of other things going on in your life? How does that all work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in graduate school, I was kind of tutored in this way of reading literature called what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion. And really, this is a kind of an antagonistic way of thinking about a book, is thinking that the author is a relic of their historical time, or there are biases in the book that the author is not aware of. And so the author is someone to be distrusted. And to a certain extent, I think that I'm interested in the ways in which that is a useful intellectual move, right? And I've maybe my answer to the previous question kind of demonstrated my interest in that, and thinking about narratives and being distrustful of them. But the result of that, when you kind of apply that same level of thinking to your life, is a kind of nihilism or a kind of despair about what has meaning and what doesn't. And it seemed not coincidental that that throughout the 20th century, a lot of narratives were kind of falling by the wayside. Vietnam made us distrustful of our government, and we can even go back into the late 1800s when Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God. So like religion, government, even now truth, our conception of consensus reality is kind of falling by the wayside. There's so many competing narratives about what is real and what is true, and it's causing lots of fracturing in our country. And as someone who takes those things seriously, and was applying them to my personal life, I felt genuinely confused about where I should place my value and where I should put my time and my energy and my heart. And really, if there's a kind of thematic arc to the book, I do think that there's a way in which I kind of arrive at a different place at the end of the book, a kind of re-enchantment with a very cautious narrative that begins with how we see one another, right? Like something so basic. And for me, the most readily intimate example was my marriage, right? And the actual act of a ceremony of the public kind of vow taking is a renunciation of the self, and you're kind of taking up seeing the world between two people's eyes, right? Sharing that with one spouse. And obviously, I wouldn't say that marriage is the only way that one can go about kind of having that dispositional or perspectival change, right? But for me, it did begin to, and I kind of sound like uxorious, or like I'm like a wife guy or something, but but really the sort of marriage interests me on an intellectual level because it really is the instantiation of a self-surrender. You're kind of seeing the world from another person's point of view every day, and there's a kind of daily negotiation of that effort. And what else is marriage? What else is family but a kind of narrative that you agree to every day? And it's something that hinges upon belief and enchantment. And there's actually a book that's in the background here by Stanley Cavell. And he's an American philosopher and really, really interesting thinker. But he has a number of essays about the screwball comedies from the 1930s and 40s, things like movies with Irene Dunn and Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And so he's interested in the comedies of remarriage and how basically that kind of idea of re-enchanting a marriage through perspectival change. And Cavell actually makes a very provocative point, which he says basically the same calisthenics that one adopts in a marriage, be them emotional or imaginative, how we regard the other person, are the same sorts of calisthenics or mental gymnastics that are required for participation in a democracy. And that's, I mean, that's kind of an insane and daring argument. But it's also something that strikes me as rather beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm, like fully enchanted. I think I'm just too skeptical by nature, but that is personally, I think what's happened. Yeah.
So, something that I found interesting in your book was that a good number of the essays make a reference to either candidate or President Trump, and how he might shift the lens through which we've seen so many things. So I guess I'm just sort of I'm wondering, how much did the past 4 or 5 years, particularly under the Trump administration, influence the book? How, and what might the book have been had there been a President Hillary Clinton or someone else?
Yeah, that's a great question. Gosh, where to even begin with that question? I mean, I guess the title is an interesting starting point. So Summerland, the term Summerland actually comes from the spiritualist religion. It's their term for the afterlife, a kind of heaven, you could call it. And obviously I went to Lilydale and spent time with the spiritualist community. So these are people who believe in spirits interacting with the earthly realm. I was interested in the ways in which, during the Trump administration, members of the commentariat had said that the nation had committed suicide. There's a very famous letter of John Adams writing in 1814 who said that there was not a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. And there was an extent to which I felt like the Trump administration had kind of shepherded us into this post-posthumous age, that we were in this kind of American afterlife where everything that I took to be well-meaning about this country was being eviscerated. Gleeful violence was being performed upon it. And it was hard not to sense a kind of ailment in the body politic and a kind of deep confusion. I mean, there was, how many endless think pieces of people walking around stunned after the 2016 election, that the day after, right? As this kind of cataclysmic and stultifying event. And so I do think that so much of the book is haunted by the specter of Trump and the phenomena that kind of both was born of him, but also accrued around him, kind of dormant phenomena that was already present in the culture, but kind of glommed on to the president, such that 2016 and thereafter made it difficult not to kind of associate those things with him. And I don't think we're done with those things, unfortunately. I think they've too deeply inflected, or I should say infected, some quadrants of the American psyche that I'm not particularly looking forward to 2024. I think the epistemological crisis that we're dealing with in terms of how we come to a consensus reality, how we think about facts, is very frightening. And a lot of the pieces in the book deal with that. There's the piece about conspiracy theories. So that presidency, I think, I do hope that the pieces transcend their moment, but it's hard not to think about how at least some component of the thematic architecture wasn't formed by Trump. Yeah.
So again, we're talking about Lost in Summerland with Barrett Swanson. The Library Journal writes, this wide-ranging work is part literary collection, part cultural examination. It should appeal to armchair travelers interested in learning about different worldviews and finding meaning in everyday life. We have a couple questions from the audience. This question is from Ellen. Hi, Barrett and Steven. This is a fabulous conversation. Thank you. Thank you for the compliment. Barrett, I haven't seen your book yet, and I'm curious to know what form you chose for the essays. Are they traditional essays, or did you make any hybrid or experimental moves in them?
Oh gosh, a really good question, Ellen. Thank you so much for that. Sheesh. Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a lot of different genres at present in the book. There's an essay that's kind of a straight ahead. There's essays that are kind of more straight ahead personal essays. A lot of pieces that begin as long form journalistic assignments. So I was dispatched by a magazine to go cover something, and there are pieces of criticism. There are a couple of pieces of criticism where I'm looking at literature. But one of the things that I take as a kind of stylistic imperative, or something that, this is kind of cartwheeling back to Steve's earlier question about balancing or thinking about the personal disclosure within a piece, is that usually what happens during the writing process is that I will be in a supposed genre, right? Like I'll be asked to write a magazine piece and go cover some subculture. And then what invariably happens is that I reach a standstill, or something begins to feel false to me, or it feels removed and distant. And so what I frequently find myself doing is forgetting the conventions of whatever genre I'm in. I kind of deliberate amnesia almost. And I find myself putting in or turning a magazine piece into a personal essay, or taking a magazine piece and then it becomes cultural criticism, or taking literary criticism and then it becomes a meditation on me and my friends. And so in that sense, it is kind of like a hybrid genre, but it's not, I teach creative nonfiction, and it's not necessarily like one of those, those very cool sort of experimental approaches, like the hermit crab essay, where you write an essay that kind of takes up the form of its subject. So you're writing an essay about your divorce in a legal brief format or something like that. I don't tend to do those kinds of formal experimentations as much, but it's kind of like a stylistic or a procedural hybridity is kind of what I'm up to. And for me, that's not out of any kind of stylistic urgency or feeling like I need to keep things fresh. For me, it's just about thinking about how best to implicate myself, or basically, I'm always trying to be forthright with the reader about why I'm writing this piece. Like, why am I the one who has decided to go to this place, and kind of earning, the sort of classic rhetorical thing would be like ethos, right? Like, why am I going here? Who am I to go here and think about these things in these places? And so it's that kind of hybridity, or that kind of impulse to mess with the genre, or the expectations or conventions of genre, is born of that impulse, kind of like an ethical one.
Yeah. We've got a couple more questions. I hope to get to them all. This is from Ryan Walsh. Barrett, how have or are your encounters / adventures with so many different people feeding or otherwise relating to your fiction writing? Are you writing fiction, and how do you sort of prevent, or how do you invite the experience that you're having from sort of bleeding into and influencing your fiction?
It's a good question. Thanks, Ryan, for that question. I feel like Ryan is a friend of mine, so I assume this is like a gentle nudge that he wants me to write fiction again. And to which I say, like, come on, man, aren't I doing enough for you? I am starting to write fiction again. I find that I'm attracted to the challenge of writing fiction again. I wrote a story that they really love and that I'm proud of, called Annie Radcliffe, You Are Loved. And what I found, it enjoyed some success. And I found that in the wake of that experience, I kept rewriting. I don't know, Steve, if you feel this, but like when you write something that you've done really well, you kind of do it again, right? Like you want to write that same story. And that's kind of what happened to me, is I kept writing the same, I mean, obviously it was different characters and different procedures, the same gestures, same emotional swerves. And that's what drew me into nonfiction, just kind of trying something else. But my fiction is somewhat informed by these journalistic encounters. It's weird. I'm really committed to a style of fiction that's predicated upon, I mean, unsurprisingly, I'm talking about Virginia Woolf at the start of this thing, kind of the brain voice. Michael Silverblatt, the critic from KCRW's Bookworm, which is an amazing show if you don't know that show, he refers to this as kind of the brain voice of characters. And I'm really interested in kind of capturing that and kind of the drama of mind. What is a character thinking, even if they're going through a banal activity? And so it's weird because my nonfiction is very different. It's kind of predicated on these rather dramatic scenarios, these very, very pyrotechnic scenarios. So I think in my fiction, I'm just far more interested in character or language than I am in these kinds of adventures. So it's a different muscularity, which is why it takes me a little while to get back into it. But I am working on a story presently. So there's something in the hopper. Yeah.
So I mean, I've met and heard lectures from people who've sort of made distinguished careers as nonfiction writers, essay writers, and fiction writers. And I'm told that nonfiction is actually easier to write.
I mean, they're both hard. They're both hard in different ways. I mean, I know that's like a kind of banal answer.
No, you have to pick a team.
Yeah, I have to pick a team. All right. I think, I mean, for me, I think nonfiction is harder because there's particularly the type of nonfiction that I do where you're balancing so many different factors, particularly your relationship with the subjects, how you're going to manage this research, particularly when you don't have, a graduate degree in whatever subculture you're going to. So you kind of have to tutor yourself in this thing and then go to this place. And I have the neurochemistry of a toddler, so going to these places is like really difficult for me. So yeah, I don't know, but then fiction's hard for other reasons. So sure. I don't know. That was my attempt to be on a team, Steve.
Thank you for indulging in my petty team assigning. Another question, this time from Michael Carlson. In lieu of asking a Barack Obama staffer-esque stupefying question, could you select an essay that you're most proud of? If so, what about it are you proud and why?
Thanks, Michael. What am I proud of? I guess the title essay. That piece, for those who haven't read that piece, it chronicles a kind of my brother's traumatic brain injury and his subsequent experience with psychic phenomena. He professes to be a psychic, and he and I went to that spiritualist community, which I've alluded to earlier, and spent five days engaging in a kind of carousel of new age activities and doing seances and all these things. And during the course of that experience, my brother demonstrated things that made me suspend my disbelief, not only about certain physical laws, but also just our connection. And I had to, in the course of that piece, I had to reckon with my my past with suicidal ideation. And I guess I'm proud of that piece, just because I was willing to go there. And I think that piece really opened up a lot of things for me as a writer, and kind of taught me, writing the piece taught me some of that stuff about what I was talking about earlier, about the kind of triangulation between writer, reader, and subject. And I basically just wanted to kind of forge a relationship between me and my brother, and me and my brother and the reader during the course of that. And it's, yeah, I guess that's why. I don't know. I mean, at a certain point, all of my articulation kind of falls away when I talk about that piece. I think that's maybe why I'm proud of it, is because it kind of stands for itself. Yeah.
But that piece in particular really is sort of the cornerstone, I think, of the entire. I mean, the piece has so much in common with everything else. Not only, you know, taking the trip to see, you know, the psychics and the soothsayers, but, you know, it's deeply introspective. But it also sort of reveals, you know, your love for your family. Like, if there's one thing that I think that sort of runs through the book, it's almost each of those, and no other essay, in my opinion, sort of encapsulate all those values, and
Yeah.
you know, the adventure, and also how you're perceiving the state of our nation more than that.
Yeah. Thank you. That's hugely gratifying to hear, because that's what I was trying to do. Yeah.
And that is essay, I believe, that you've sold the rights to, right?
I did sell the film rights to Channing Tatum's company,
Yes.
Free Association. So hopefully they move on the option, and it's, you know, they'll get Vince Vaughn or somebody to play my brother.
And Channing will play you.
Yeah,
Of course.
I mean, of course, right? He's a spitting image of me. Yeah.
So
I joke that, like, well, yeah.
No, please.
I was gonna say, I feel like Paul Giamatti is probably better casting, but we'll see.
So a question from Catherine Barrett. Hello, I knew you as a child and teenager. Did you find yourself deep in thought about world and cultural conditions at age 14 and 15? If yes, how did you navigate your way through that? I mean, I think that's an excellent question, but perhaps the broader question is, you know, when exactly did you develop your critical lens? Was it sort of an awakening in college, or was it through writing, or did you just sort of were you always just someone who sort of, you know, looked out in the world and able to sort of put together associations?
I don't think so. Hi, Kathy. I'm so glad that you're here. This is really cool, just to have these people from my childhood here. This is a person whose home I would spend time in as a little kid. So this is just really wild. No, I mean, as a 14 and 15-year-old, I don't think I had. I don't think I was in deep in thought. Maybe it was a deep in feeling. I was a very sensitive kid, as Andy Bress was too. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I really kind of came into this headspace. I really kind of started indulging in my intellectual curiosities until later in college. I think in high school, I was very committed to athletics and being a jock and those sorts of things. And but it wasn't until college that I got politicized. Got really into politics when I was about 20, and started getting very involved in campaigns, and that was kind of the entry point into a lot of critical discourse around social problems. And then you know, my education, I had really amazing professors both in undergrad and graduate school that kind of tutored me and nurtured those kind of aspects of my headspace. Yeah.
So we only have a couple more minutes and just one or two, perhaps time for one or two more questions. But we haven't completely, we touched upon this when we were talking about the presidency of Donald Trump. I'm wondering, so much of the essays, explore and challenge our ideas of what, the American ideal is. And I'm wondering, what exactly, when you completed this book and you reviewed all the essays and you're seeing how they fit together, what is it that you can tell us about the state of the American ideal?
Oh God, Steve. What?
And you have 5 minutes.
I don't know. I mean, there is, I'm flashing on something that I heard George Saunders say recently, that I found deeply moving. And he said that inside every person, there's like 100,000 iterations of a self, right? There's like all these different permutations of who you can be at any given moment. And when we are receptors to certain information, different versions of us get activated. So some, 100 possibilities out of those 10,000 selves kind of come to the fore and take over. And Saunders rather brilliantly makes the point that like, that Trump really activated the worst iterations in people. And I think that one of the things that, my interest in politics is born of is the ways in which the narrative that we tell ourselves by whom we elect kind of draws the parameters for our emotional, intellectual, interpersonal life. And I, as a citizen, as a person, as a writer, am acutely committed to doing my best to interrogate the narratives by which I presume to live, but also being generous in thinking about why someone is adopting a narrative, and then how to be in conversation with those people and try to come up with better narratives. And that's why I typically don't talk about it in this kind of capacity, why I usually do it in the space of an essay where I can kind of, localize it within the particulars and parameters and nuances of a given topic, right? Particularly when so many of these essays kind of circle back to very deep structural issues, structural racism, structural inequality, neoliberalism, patriarchy, these things that are very vexed and convoluted. And so yeah, it's real hard to talk about. So you really teed me up for a very difficult answer, but I hope that was, I don't even know.
Is this a moment that's going to be in an essay pretty soon?
Yes.
My jackass friend asked me to commentate on the state of America. You can use my real name. I won't be offended.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
So we only have about 2 minutes left. The book, of course, is Lost in Summerland. If you haven't bought it, please support Boswell or any of your local indies. One more question before we go. There's one, you continue to write, and there's some essays that you've written after this. The most recent, I think, is about you going on another adventure, this time to meet some TikTok superstars, people who sort of gain a great deal of attention and earn a living through social media. And so for people who want to read that, that's available. I think it was in last week's Harper's. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that and that experience?
Yeah, I was commissioned by Harper's Magazine to go to what's called a collab mansion, which is like people in their late teens and early 20s who are kind of ridiculously famous among young people and they are social media influencers who spend every blink and breath making content, and they get paid exorbitant amounts of money by brands, sometimes as much as $60,000 for a 10-second TikTok video. And I was asked to go to by Harper's to go to this place and kind of spend time with these influencers for 4 or 5 days. And yeah, I mean, as is the case with a lot of my work, by the end of the trip, I ultimately, I mean, felt the impulse to kind of chuckle at how silly TikTok dances are, and how kind of absurd it is that these kids are making money, such gross amounts of money, doing something so simple, and oftentimes avoiding college to go do that. But I left that experience ultimately finding those kids to be demonstrative of a certain impulse that a lot of us have on the internet, which is to kind of present ourselves as brands, and this like increasingly porous border between our virtual and visceral selves, and constantly putting ourselves online, and what that is doing to us. And I particularly see it in myself, and I see it in my friends, and I see it in my students, the ways in which the imperatives of social media and the addictive nature of some of those platforms is causing us pain. And so that the piece ended up going in a place where I didn't anticipate it going, and it ended up being about my own impulses as a professor to kind of be likable, and kind of, the ways in which the kind of systemic nature of the university itself was kind of asking us to be as a kind of like almost retailers, and it's a weird moment. So yeah, that's what the essay ended up being about. And those kids actually put me in a TikTok video that got like 30,000 views in 10 seconds. It was the most frightening experience of my life.
And you're not even on Twitter, like you can't even enjoy that.
Oh, what is to enjoy? No, I was terrified. I was so terrified. I immediately, just like raced to the bathroom to look at the comments and see if people were making fun of me.
So, Barrett, I think we've run out of time. Again, the book is Lost in Summerland, which is available from our host, Boswell Books, who I want to thank so much for giving us this opportunity to talk. I hope you enjoyed the talk as much as I did, and I apologize for asking about the state of the American dream.
No apologies necessary. That was amazing. We have like 5 people asking where they can watch the TikTok video. So if you wind up helping me find the link, I can send it out to people later. Thank you so much, both of you. Great success, continued success to both of you. And thank you to the Friends of the Milwaukee Public Library. And also thank you to everyone enjoying the event, because we wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you. So hope to see you at another event.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you.